Candace Owens thought it would be business as usual, until Jasmine Crockett calmly dismantled her point by point, leaving viewers speechless without ever raising her voice. The air in the studio felt charged, but not in a way anyone could quite name. Producers were adjusting lights. A stage manager gave last-minute hand signals. Camera 3 swept left and focused in. The host was smiling a little too wide, like he sensed something brewing but didn't dare say it aloud. The panel was already seated, 4 chairs, 1 host, 2 commentators, and 1 congresswoman. Candace Owens was dressed sharp, as always, calm, confident, a pro at these settings. She'd done this dance before. She knew how to work a moment, take a jab, spin it into a punchline, walk out viral. She wasn't nervous. Why would she be? Across from her sat Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, poised, steady, barely blinking. She wore no visible tension, but behind that calm was someone who had come prepared, not for a debate, but for something far less rehearsed. Truth. The show was Voices Tonight, live from a studio in Tempe, Arizona. An election cycle special streamed across platforms, audience in studio, phones recording, every second watched, no time delay. The topic was billed as a discussion on race, class, and the future of American policy, a familiar playground for both women, though they came from different planets politically. Owens, known for confronting progressive views with a smile and sharp elbows. Crockett, a first-term congresswoman from Dallas, more methodical than fiery, except when pushed. 30 seconds, someone off camera called. Candace sipped water. Jasmine glanced at her notepad once, then folded it closed and didn't touch it again. The host, Rich Langley, introduced the guests, his voice bouncing between politeness and ratings-ready hype. We're joined tonight by Candace Owens, a conservative political commentator, and Representative Jasmine Crockett of Texas's 30th District. Ladies, thank you both for being here. Both nodded. Owens leaned in a bit, smile ready. Crockett just waited. We're discussing policy and perception. Let's start with race, Langley said. Some people say America is more divided than ever, racially, economically. Others say the division is manufactured. Candace, your take? Right on cue, Owens answered. The division is definitely manufactured, and it's being driven by a victim mentality encouraged by people in power. They benefit when people think they're oppressed. The truth is, if you work hard in this country, no matter who you are, you will succeed, period. She turned slightly, angled toward Crockett. And the narrative that certain groups can't get ahead is harmful, she added. It's dishonest. Crockett didn't blink. Her voice came clear, with none of the fake civility so often used in televised debates. Candace, I represent over 700,000 people, she said, eyes steady. I see what they go through. I see how policy, real policy, impacts real lives. And no, hard work isn't always enough when the systems are stacked. You know that. Owens opened her mouth, but Crockett kept going. Let's talk about what you said last year on Daily Wire. You said, quote, I've never seen a black person who didn't make it in America unless they chose not to. Do you still believe that? Langley blinked. Owens tried to smile again, but something in the studio felt tighter now. I do, Owens replied. Because in my experience, success is a choice. And what people don't want to hear is that personal responsibility matters. Crockett nodded slowly, as if confirming she had just gotten the answer she expected. But what about Renetta Davis? She said, a pause. She's a single mother in Pleasant Grove, works 2 jobs, still can't afford basic health care because her zip code was redlined back in the 60s and investment never followed. Her son qualified for a school voucher but couldn't use it because the nearest private school is over 45 minutes away and there's no bus. Is that a choice she made? Candace blinked. The crowd shifted, phones tilted upward. Langley interjected, we'll get into education and healthcare next, but Crockett didn't stop. This isn't theory. These are lives. And when you tell people like Renetta they're not trying hard enough, you're not just wrong. You're cruel. But Candace wasn't rattled yet. She was calculating and about to make a move she thought would win the room. Candace leaned forward just slightly, enough to signal that she was ready to reclaim control. Her tone didn't change, but her posture did. She had a line locked and loaded. Well, she said, if you are going to build your argument on one person's sad story, you can paint anything as broken. But personal anecdotes aren't policy. They're emotion. And emotion doesn't build wealth or fix communities. That line landed with a chill. Owens glanced at the audience, expecting to see heads nodding. A few did, but most faces were unreadable. Crockett wasn't fazed. Jasmine let a pause sit before answering. She didn't rush. She let the tension grow legs. "You just called a mother's life a sad story," Crockett said slowly. "That's where we are." Owens tried to respond, but Jasmine lifted a hand gently, not to silence, but to steady the rhythm. "I'm not here to throw punches," she said, "but you walked in here with a checklist, talking points, sound bites, things you've said a dozen times to audiences who already agree with you. But I'm not here to clap. I'm here to tell you what the people living your slogans are actually going through." Langley glanced at his producer, who gestured to keep rolling. This wasn't what they rehearsed, but it was working. "I don't need to quote studies," Crockett continued. "I can tell you what happened when rent in South Dallas went up 40% in 3 years while wages flatlined. Or what it's like watching grandmothers line up outside a city office at 5 in the morning just to get help with a light bill. You think that's about emotion? That's math. That's what it costs to survive when policy forgets your zip code." The studio was still. Candace narrowed her eyes slightly, tapping her finger against the armrest of her chair. Then she struck back. "I grew up with nothing," she said. "Section 8 housing, government cheese. My grandfather was a janitor, but he taught us not to complain. He told us the world doesn't owe us understanding, it owes us nothing. So we worked. We didn't wait for handouts." Crockett nodded, this time with real respect. "I respect your story," she said, "but it's yours, and you've turned it into a measuring stick you hold against everyone else. What if someone else's story doesn't line up with yours? Do they just not count?" Candace tilted her head, trying to stay composed. She replied, "What I'm saying is, if you keep telling people they're victims, they'll act like it. That's what holds communities back. Not policy, not racism, mindset." That's when Jasmine stopped looking at her and turned to the audience. "Just for a second. I've sat with people who bury their own children because they couldn't afford insulin," she said. "I've listened to grandmothers tell me they're afraid to call the police when something's wrong because they don't know what'll happen next. That's not mindset. That's fear. That's grief." She looked back at Owens. "And you think telling them to change their mindset is going to fix that?" Owens was quiet. For just a beat too long, Langley tried to pivot. "Let's bring this back to the broader issue of government support." But Crockett didn't let go. "You keep saying people are addicted to help. What they're addicted to," she said, "is hoping something finally works, hoping their vote actually means their kids don't have to live with the same fear, or the same hunger, or the same silence." Candace folded her arms, and for the first time, she didn't interrupt. "You've made a career saying the system works," Crockett continued, "but when it's never failed you in ways that cost you safety, food, or dignity, can you even see the cracks?" Candace opened her mouth, but no words came. But Crockett wasn't done, and the next thing she said would turn the whole night into something no one could ignore. "You once said," Crockett began, her voice steady, "that America doesn't have a race problem. It has a truth problem." Candace looked at her warily, sensing something was coming. Crockett shifted in her chair, not to make herself more comfortable, but to settle in, the way someone does before laying something down that can't be taken back. "I watched that clip," she said. "I watched it more than once because I wanted to understand how someone who looks like me, who comes from struggle, could say something that wide, that absolute." Owens gave a half smile, the kind she used when she wanted to appear unbothered. "I stand by it." "I figured you would," Crockett replied, "so I brought receipts." There was a light rustle from the audience. Langley glanced at the control room. Someone nodded. He motioned for the producer to roll it. Behind them, a screen came to life. A clip played, Owens on a podcast from 2 years ago. "Black Americans," she said in the video, "are the most emotionally manipulated group in the country. They've been trained to see racism in everything. It's a lie that keeps them trapped." The clip ended. Crockett didn't look smug. She didn't even look angry. She looked tired. "Every time I visit a school, I meet kids who have already been taught that they don't matter," she said. "Not because someone told them directly, but because their textbooks are 10 years old. Because there's mold in the ceiling. Because their teachers are overworked and underpaid. You think they're being trained to see racism? Or are they just seeing it?" Owens opened her mouth. "That clip's old and taken out of context." "But you said it," Crockett shot back. "On record, in front of people, You said it like it was fact. Candace inhaled sharply. What I said is that victimhood culture is dangerous. People who think they're oppressed will act oppressed. It's disempowering. Crockett leaned forward for the first time. You know what's more dangerous than victimhood culture? She asked. Gaslighting. The room went still. When people go through pain and then someone on TV tells them it's all in their head, that's not empowerment. That's abuse. There were no gasps. No one shouted. It was the kind of silence that hangs in the room when someone says what no one else wants to touch. Langley shifted in his seat. Let's not make this personal. It is personal, Crockett said, not angrily but firmly. It's personal for the girl in Shreveport who has to take 2 buses just to get to a grocery store with fresh produce. It's personal for the young man in East St. Louis who's been stopped 7 times and never charged. It's personal for the teacher in Baton Rouge who pays for her students' supplies out of pocket and still gets told she's failing them. Owens exhaled through her nose. I'm not the enemy, she said. I never said you were, Crockett replied, but you're not helping either when you act like these problems don't exist. There was a brief flicker in Owens's eyes, something between frustration and disbelief. You're misrepresenting everything I've said, she argued. I never denied hardship. I'm saying we need to stop blaming the system and start owning our part. And I'm telling you, Crockett responded, when a house is on fire, you don't tell the people inside to stop panicking and take responsibility for the flames. You help them put it out. The audience stirred again, not loud, but enough to feel. Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. I didn't come here to win an argument, she said. I came here because people are tired of screaming for help and being told to whisper. But Owens wasn't finished yet, and her next move wasn't defensive. It was personal. Candace straightened her spine and placed both hands on the table in front of her. Her voice dropped just a notch, less defensive now, more deliberate. You know what I think the real problem is? She asked, looking directly at Crockett. It's not policy. It's not history. It's that we've allowed people to build their identity around struggle, around being wounded, around pain. And when that pain becomes your badge of honor, you stop looking for solutions. Crockett raised her eyebrows but didn't interrupt. Candace continued, now turning slightly to face the studio audience. People like Jasmine, she said, mean well, but they keep people stuck by reminding them of what's broken instead of what's possible. Instead of saying, let's fix this, they say, let's relive it. That's why nothing changes. There it was, the pivot. Reframe the entire conversation. Put Crockett in the role of the emotional leader stuck in the past, while Owens positioned herself as the clear-eyed realist, urging progress. It was a tactic she had used before. It usually worked, but not this time. Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't get angry. She just tilted her head slightly, like she was studying something that didn't quite line up. Are you saying we should ignore pain? She asked. I'm saying we shouldn't build a movement around it, Candace replied. Pain isn't power, it's weakness. And constantly reminding people of how they've been wronged just keeps them stuck. That's when Jasmine spoke, not with heat, but with something quieter, heavier. You know what kept my mother going when my father left? She said. Pain. You know what kept my constituents fighting when they had to march in 100-degree heat just to stop a factory from poisoning their neighborhood? Pain. She leaned back, hands still in her lap. Pain is power, when you carry it right, when you use it to push instead of fold. Candace looked like she wanted to respond, but Crockett wasn't done. And I don't remind people of what's broken just to grieve. I remind them so they don't get tricked into thinking nothing was ever wrong, because that's what you're doing. Langley opened his mouth to jump in, but Crockett kept speaking, her voice just above a whisper. You're trying to talk people out of their scars. Like if they forget how they got them, they'll finally heal. A few people in the audience murmured. It wasn't dramatic, just real. Candace looked frustrated now. Her tone sharpened. You're twisting what I said. No, Crockett said calmly. I'm answering it. The tension had shifted. The usual back-and-forth rhythm of the show had been broken, and the audience noticed. Candace tried again. You think I'm trying to erase history. I'm not. I'm trying to tell people they're not defined by it. But what happens, Crockett asked, when the history keeps repeating? That landed hard. Langley cleared his throat, trying to salvage the pacing. "Let's pivot slightly," he said. "Congresswoman, you've mentioned your district. Can you give us an example of something that's worked? Something where government policy made a positive impact?" Crockett nodded. "Sure. When we passed the Housing Stability Act last year, we were able to funnel federal funds into East Lancaster for rental assistance. It didn't fix everything, but over 800 families avoided eviction. Kids stayed in school. Single parents didn't have to start over again for the 5th time in 5 years." She looked at Owens again. That wasn't emotion. That was impact. Candace was quiet. And in that silence, something shifted. Not defeat, but recognition, just for a moment, that maybe this conversation wasn't going the way she'd imagined. "You can inspire people to rise above their circumstances," Crockett said. "But first, you have to acknowledge what they're standing in." But the real storm wasn't in the studio. It was already brewing outside the walls, across the internet, where people were clipping and sharing in real time. Outside the studio, phones buzzed in laps and purses. Clips from the broadcast were already up on TikTok, Instagram, X, and Facebook. In living rooms and barbershops, the same 6 words kept replaying. "You're trying to talk people out of their scars." That line stuck. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't yelled, but it hit something people carried quietly, and that made it louder than any applause. Inside the studio, the cameras kept rolling, but the atmosphere had changed. Langley sensed it too. He was glancing more often at the control room, but they gave no direction, just a thumbs up. He leaned forward. "Let's talk solutions. What does accountability look like, both from government and individuals?" Crockett answered first this time. "It looks like showing up with both ears open," she said. "When I hold town halls, I don't just come to speak. I come to listen. And what people tell me again and again is that they're tired of being statistics. They want to be seen." She turned toward Owens. "And being seen means having someone on national TV acknowledge that your experience matters. Not just your potential, but your pain." Candace crossed her legs, holding a pen she hadn't used all night. "That's fair," she said, "but it's a two-way street. People need to stop looking at the government like a savior. Communities thrive when they take responsibility for their outcomes." Now the tone was measured again, controlled. This was her safe ground. But Crockett didn't argue. She nodded once. "Community responsibility matters," she agreed. "But that doesn't mean government gets to skip its part. You can't tell someone to clean their own kitchen when you've been the one breaking their windows and flooding their floor." The line made someone in the audience say, quietly, "That part." Langley decided to shift tactics. "Let's open the conversation to the room," he said. "We've got a few guests who've submitted questions earlier today." He motioned to a young woman in the second row, early 20s, denim jacket, natural hair pulled into a bun. She stood up nervously and looked between the 2 women. "My name's Kara," she said. "I go to Arizona State. My question is for both of you. When you say listen to the people, what does that mean to you personally? Like, beyond the politics?" Owen smiled tightly. "For me, it means not assuming people are fragile. I listen by being honest, even if it's uncomfortable. I believe people are stronger than they think." Crockett waited, then answered with a story. "A few weeks ago," she said, "I met a man named Clyde in Lancaster. He was in his 70s, Vietnam vet. He told me he's voted in every election since 1972, but this year he didn't know if he would." She paused. "When I asked why, he said, because I don't know if anybody hears us anymore. I think they hear our noise, but not our meaning." She looked at Kira. "So to me, listening means hearing the meaning, not just the noise." Kira sat back down. A few audience members clapped softly. Langley looked down at his notes but didn't speak. Candace sat forward again. "You're right," she said. "People want to be heard, but I think we also have to be careful not to confuse hearing with agreeing. Just because someone feels something deeply doesn't make it automatically true. That's why I challenge narratives, because sometimes what we think is oppression is just life being hard." Crockett looked at her directly. "And sometimes what we call life being hard is a choice someone else made generations ago that's still costing people today." The room was still again. Langley looked like he might end the segment, but a second audience member, a man in his 50s wearing a service uniform, stood up without being asked. "I served in the Army 23 years, he said, "and I agree with some of what Candace said. Discipline matters. Self-responsibility matters. but I also came home to a neighborhood that didn't. He looked tired, not angry, just worn. Same block I left in 1991 is worse now than when I got deployed. So I hear both of you, but I think the real truth is we need both. We need tough love, but we also need love that's just love. Crockett nodded slowly. Owens said nothing, but the real impact wouldn't hit until after the show, when people realized they'd witnessed a conversation that felt like something we rarely get anymore, real. The commercial break came and went. The studio lights dimmed and rose again, but the energy didn't reset. It lingered. Whatever had been cracked open in the last segment hadn't been sealed back up. Langley welcomed viewers back, then turned to Owens. "Candace," he said, "you've mentioned before that statistics often get misused to create a victim narrative. But let's talk about numbers for a minute. What data do you think people are getting wrong?" Candace was ready. When people say the justice system is inherently racist, they ignore context. Yes, there are disparities, but disparities don't always mean discrimination. Sometimes they're the result of behavior patterns. We don't want to talk about that because it's uncomfortable. She leaned into the moment. If 70% of violent crimes in certain neighborhoods are committed by young black men, that's not about racism. That's about culture, family breakdown, lack of discipline. And until we talk about that honestly, nothing will change. A few murmurs passed through the crowd. Some nodded. Others didn't move. Langley glanced at Crockett. "Congresswoman?" Jasmine took a second before speaking, not because she didn't have something to say, but because she knew what was coming next mattered more than any numbers alone. "You're right about one thing," she began. "Numbers do matter, but what matters more is what questions we're asking before we run those numbers." She pulled out a sheet of paper, not notes, but something more official. "This is a report from the Marshall Project, cross-checked with federal prison data. It shows that black Americans are incarcerated at nearly 5 times the rate of white Americans. But here's what gets missed. When you control for poverty, education, and neighborhood, those disparities drop dramatically. Meaning what? Meaning the problem isn't race. It's what's been done to people who've been left behind." She didn't look at Owens. She looked at the camera. And who gets left behind again and again? People in broken school districts, people with underfunded hospitals, people who get redlined, underhired, over-policed. Candace shifted in her seat. Crockett continued, this time facing her directly. "You say it's about behavior. I say behavior is often a reaction. You can't tell people to swim harder when you're the one dropping the anchor." That landed harder than expected. Owens raised a finger. "That logic erases personal choice. Are there challenges? Of course. But if we blame everything on history, we take away agency from the individual. You're telling people they're powerless." Crockett shook her head once. "No," she said. "I'm telling them they're not invisible." Silence. Then she leaned forward. "You keep using crime stats like they're proof of culture collapse. But if you dig deeper, those same communities also have the highest numbers of under-resourced schools, eviction rates, asthma from industrial zoning, and trauma-related hospital visits. Is that culture too, or is that something else?" Candace looked to Langley for a lifeline. None came. "I'm not defending crime," Crockett said, "but I am asking, what made the ground soft in the first place? What planted the chaos? Because that's what real accountability looks like. Tracing the full story, not just the headline." The audience was silent again, but not passive. They were following, watching, feeling. Langley looked at his watch, but didn't cut it short. He just asked, "If you had to name one solution, what would it be?" Crockett didn't hesitate. "Direct investment, not charity, not band-aids. Structural investment in education, housing, transportation, and mental health services. Give people tools, not lectures." Owens jumped in. "And I say we need more nuclear families, stronger fathers, less victim language, and schools that stop indoctrinating kids with the idea that they're oppressed." She spoke fast, like she knew time was slipping. Crockett nodded once. "I agree about strong families," she said, "but let's be honest. A strong family doesn't mean much when they can't get a doctor within 20 miles, or when their neighborhood floods every time it rains because the city hasn't fixed the drainage in 20 years. Langley blinked. Owens opened her mouth, then closed it again. Crockett said it softly. You can't talk about pulling yourself up by the bootstraps if the boots were never handed out in the first place. But while the audience was absorbing that, something else was brewing. People online were starting to demand a full transcript of the exchange. They didn't want sound bites. They wanted receipts. As soon as they cut to commercial again, the studio shifted. Not loudly, but noticeably. A few audience members whispered across rows. One of the tech crew walked briskly behind the cameras, shaking his head like he was reacting to something he saw on his phone. Back on set, Owens sat still, arms crossed, eyes down. She was scrolling through something on her screen. Crockett didn't move. She just leaned back slightly, looking toward the edge of the studio lights like she was resetting herself. A producer stepped in from the side and crouched near Owens, whispering something. She didn't whisper back, just nodded once, clipped and tense. Langley glanced toward the control booth again. You could tell they were trying to decide whether to extend the segment or start wrapping it. But by now, the show had taken on a rhythm of its own. Cutting it short would have felt like turning off a faucet while water still poured. And while the audience was quiet, the internet was not. On a phone in the back row, a post from a verified account read, Candace Owens just got schooled by a congresswoman who doesn't need volume to bring fire. It had 27,000 likes and counting. Meanwhile, a different clip from the first segment, Jasmine asking about Renetta Davis in Pleasant Grove, was already trending. People were adding their own city, their own story. That's my auntie in Detroit. That's my neighbor in Stockton. That's my whole street in Jacksonville. Inside the studio, the heat had shifted. Not physical temperature, but you could feel it. Candace was no longer pacing the conversation. She was reacting, and that wasn't her strength. Langley tried to cut through it. Ladies, we're coming back in 30. Let's try to bring this back to the broader issue of unity. What brings people together? Owens didn't answer. She looked past him. Her phone buzzed again, and this time she turned it face down. Crockett didn't move. She wasn't gloating. She didn't look smug or smug adjacent. She looked like someone who'd carried this conversation for longer than the cameras had been rolling. The floor manager gave the countdown. 10 seconds. Langley ran a hand down his tie and said under his breath, "Let's land this, please." The red light flashed back on. "We're back," Langley said smoothly. "And we've had a passionate, nuanced conversation tonight. But let's shift gears for a moment. Can we talk about hope? What gives each of you hope for the communities you speak to?" Owens jumped in, her voice sharper now. "What gives me hope," she said, "is that I know we don't have to agree to grow. We're not always going to see eye to eye, but I believe Black Americans are stronger than we think. We don't need the government to fix us. We need to remember who we are. That's the message I bring." Langley nodded, clearly relieved to have her back in the rhythm. Then Crockett spoke. "You know what gives me hope?" she said softly. "When a 12-year-old girl in Oak Cliff looks me in the eye and tells me she wants to be a civil rights lawyer, and then shows me the notebook where she's written her first speech." She smiled faintly, just for a second. "That's what hope looks like. It's fragile. It needs support, but it's real. And it doesn't come from speeches. It comes from knowing somebody's got your back." There was a long pause. Langley glanced toward the teleprompter, then away. The silence didn't need filling. Owens turned toward her, trying once more to reach for higher ground. "I think we want the same thing," she said. "We just see different ways to get there." Crockett looked at her, no sarcasm, just steady. "I hope you're right," she said, "but words don't mean much if they're not followed by action. And if your words make people feel smaller while they're trying to stand tall, that's not a path, that's a wall." But the real storm didn't fully hit until an unaired moment, caught by a hot mic, began circulating minutes after the show ended, and it changed everything. The cameras cut, the lights dimmed slightly. Langley thanked the guests with a practiced tone, but his eyes were scanning the crew. Everyone was still moving briskly, but quieter than usual. Something about the energy didn't bounce back like it normally did once a broadcast wrapped. Jasmine Crockett stood first. She shook Langley's hand, nodded at the camera operator, and tucked her notepad into her bag. Candace stayed seated, typing something on her phone. No eye contact, no small talk. That should have been the end of it, except it wasn't. Unbeknownst to anyone on stage, one of the boom mics had been left on. The producers were moving fast, prepping for the next segment, an interview with a city councilman. and nobody noticed the feed still running hot to the backup stream. That stream, meant only for internal review, had a leak. And someone watching on the back end, maybe a staffer, maybe a rogue intern, screen recorded the whole thing. The clip lasted only 41 seconds, but it exploded like wildfire. It started with Langley walking off, leaving Candace and Jasmine alone on stage. The crew was adjusting cables, makeup was touching up a host for the next block. But Owens turned to Crockett, tone low but direct. "You think you embarrassed me tonight?" she said. "You didn't. You just played to your crowd." Crockett looked at her, not smiling. "I didn't say anything to embarrass you," she replied. "I said what needed to be said. If that made you uncomfortable, maybe ask why." Owens let out a half-laugh, dry. "You really think what you're doing is noble, huh? You think telling people they're trapped makes you brave?" Jasmine's reply came without hesitation. "No, but telling people they're free while you watch them drown? That's not brave either." Cut. That was the end of the clip. It hit Twitter at 10:42 p.m. By 11 Hankook p.m., it had over 2.1 million views. Hashtags sprang up instantly. #drowning. While free, #Crockett vs. Owens. Tell the whole story. News outlets picked it up before dawn. The context didn't matter. The emotion did. People weren't dissecting the policy debate anymore. They were talking about what that moment represented. Two black women on opposite ends of the ideological spectrum saying what a lot of people had been afraid to say out loud in front of a national audience. That one sentence from Crockett, "Telling people they're free while you watch them drown," it was being quoted like scripture. At a community breakfast in Phoenix the next morning, a high school principal repeated it to a room full of parents. On a late-night podcast out of Oakland, a youth pastor turned it into a full sermon. Even people who didn't agree with Jasmine politically admitted she said something that cracked through the noise. Meanwhile, Owens went quiet online. No tweets, no posts, just silence. Her team issued a brief statement calling the hot mic moment out of context and strategically edited. But it didn't land, because this wasn't about editing. It was about truth, spoken so plainly that no one could deny hearing it. And for a lot of people, especially those who'd grown used to being told they were exaggerating, being too emotional, too dramatic, it felt like justice. Not legislative justice, but something older, a form of clarity that couldn't be spun. In South Bend, Indiana, a young single mom posted, "I've been waiting my whole life for someone on TV to say what I've lived every day." In Topeka, Kansas, a retired teacher wrote, "She said it without yelling. That's why it hit." And in the comment section of every major network's YouTube feed, the same quote kept getting repeated. "You can't talk about pulling yourself up by the bootstraps if the boots were never handed out." The full transcript of the show was requested by over a dozen outlets. News sites were writing side-by-sides, not takedowns, not hit pieces, just the facts, finally laid out without spin. It wasn't a viral moment because it was wild. It was viral because it was real. But what happened next proved this wasn't just about one night or one show. It was the start of a shift. And that shift? It came with questions that weren't going away. By the next morning, it was everywhere. The clip wasn't just trending. It was being picked apart on morning shows, reaction channels, op-eds, and podcasts. It played on loop during breakfast in households across the country, the kind of moment that crossed political lines without needing to shout about it. Even people who didn't normally follow politics were asking, "Did you see that debate last night?" But it wasn't the debate, really. It was that one exchange. 41 seconds caught on a mic someone forgot to shut off. That accidental moment had captured something most staged interviews never could. Unfiltered honesty between two people who knew what they believed and weren't afraid to say it to each other's face. People weren't debating who won. That's what made it different. They were feeling it, relating to it, carrying it with them to work, into classrooms, and around kitchen tables. In Dayton, Ohio, a fourth-grade teacher played it for her students, not to talk politics, but to show them how disagreements don't have to end in shouting, how you can speak with strength without speaking over someone. In Fresno, California, a bus driver overheard two passengers discussing the clip. "You hear what that Congresswoman said?" one asked. "Yeah, she wasn't even trying to be famous," the other replied. "She just told the truth." That's what made it loud. The ripple effect was real, but it wasn't loud in the traditional sense. It was a quiet current, a nod, a sense that someone had finally said something out loud that had been sitting in people's chests for years. And for Candace Owens, who'd built a career out of being composed and unshakable on camera, the silence that followed her online absence was its own story. People noticed. No rebuttal video, no fiery tweet thread, just stillness. For a public figure whose brand thrived on control, that silence was louder than any denial. In the days that followed, dozens of opinion pieces surfaced. Some praised Jasmine Crockett as the new face of grounded political leadership. Others tried to defend Owens, suggesting she was ambushed, taken out of context. But those arguments didn't stick. Because viewers weren't just reacting to the words, they were reacting to the weight behind them. That's what made it different. Crockett didn't perform. She showed up as someone who'd heard these stories before and lived through parts of them herself. In a local radio interview 2 days after the taping, Jasmine was asked why she didn't take the high road and disengage. She paused, then answered plainly. "There's a difference between being polite and being silent," she said, "and I wasn't raised to let the truth sit in the corner just because someone might be uncomfortable." That interview, too, went viral. Back in Washington, a staffer in Crockett's office reported they'd received over 4,000 emails in 48 hours, most of them from people outside her district. Some were short. "Thank you for speaking for people like me." Others were long, stories of hardship, of misrepresentation, of feeling like no one ever said what needed to be said on a national platform. But all of them echoed the same theme. I felt heard. Even some conservative commentators, usually aligned with Owens, acknowledged the moment. She was prepared, sure, one said on a live stream, but it wasn't just prep. It was lived experience. That's hard to fake. The moment began shifting the way panels were booked. Producers started requesting more long-form debates, less shouting, more substance. Not because the networks had grown a conscience, but because they saw the numbers. And what Jasmine did, hold the room without raising her voice, had stuck. Crockett wasn't interested in capitalizing on it. She declined 3 talk show appearances that week. "I didn't say what I said to sell something," she told a local Dallas paper. "I said it because I couldn't not say it." Candace's team eventually released a carefully worded video. She didn't apologize. She didn't double down either. She called the moment a misunderstanding, fueled by selective editing and emotional manipulation. But it fell flat. Because by then, the public had already heard the clip. And this time, they didn't need a narrator. They'd drawn their own conclusions. But the bigger question, the one that started showing up in classrooms, family dinners, even inside campaign war rooms, wasn't about who said what. It was about what kind of leadership people really wanted next. It didn't fade in a week. The clip didn't vanish under the next scandal or celebrity misstep. It lingered, not because of the drama, but because it said something deeper about where the country really stood. People weren't quoting Jasmine Crockett because she owned someone on live TV. They were quoting her because she spoke in a way that didn't leave anyone behind. Because her words carried weight without turning heavy. Because for once, someone brought facts, feelings, and reality into the same sentence without sounding rehearsed. In a high school in Des Moines, a teacher used the clip to launch a discussion about modern political discourse. One student raised their hand and said, "She didn't just talk at people, she talked to them. That's why it mattered." In a church basement in Macon, Georgia, a small group watched the full transcript being read aloud on a projector. After it ended, one woman simply said, "She said what our mothers tried to say, just with a microphone." It wasn't just the content, it was the clarity. And in that clarity, a lesson rose that didn't need to be printed on posters or pinned in bios. Truth, when spoken clearly and calmly, doesn't need volume to echo. For Candace Owens, it was a moment she couldn't spin. Not because she was outmatched, but because she misread the room. The country had grown tired of polished debates with no substance. People didn't want talking points. They wanted someone who remembered their names, even if only symbolically. The moral wasn't about who's right. It wasn't even about left or right. It was about how easy it is to forget the people you claim to speak for when your whole life is wrapped in a studio's glow. Owens didn't fall. Her base stayed loyal. But something shifted. A quiet question began trailing her in every interview. Do you really listen? Or do you just talk better than the rest? Crockett, on the other hand, didn't change overnight. She didn't leap to stardom, but her inbox didn't stop filling. More community organizers started inviting her. More teachers started mentioning her. Even skeptics began tuning in, not because they agreed, but because they respected the way she carried herself. She wasn't flawless. She wasn't viral by design. She was real. And in today's media jungle, that's rarer than most people admit. In a post-election wrap-up a few months later, a columnist wrote, "Maybe the moment that really mattered wasn't the one with fireworks, but the one where a woman sat across from someone with power, didn't raise her voice, and still changed the temperature in every room that watched." That's what stuck, because anyone watching that clip, whether they grew up in East Baltimore, rural Nebraska, or downtown Tucson, recognized something they'd seen before. A person who finally stopped pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. A person who didn't ask for sympathy, but for sense. In the end, Jasmine Crockett didn't win a debate. She reminded people they weren't crazy for wanting better. She refused to speak softly about things that hurt just because the setting was polished. And she proved that strength isn't in shouting louder. It's in refusing to shrink, even when the lights are on and the audience is waiting for a show. If you watched that moment and felt something shift, if you saw yourself, your neighbor, or your parent in what was said, don't let it stop there. Ask more questions. Hold people accountable. Expect more from the ones with microphones and titles. Don't let calm truth be drowned out by louder noise. And if you believe stories like this need to be heard, stories that don't sugarcoat or shout, subscribe. We're not done telling the truth.